April 18, 1945, outside Magdeburg, Germany. The smoke was still drifting when Sergeant Daniel Walker noticed something glowing on a German woman's shoulder. It was faint, just a trembling ember beneath torn gray fabric, but he knew that color, that pulse, that hiss. 90 seconds later, he would be forced to tear her jacket clean off her body, before it killed her. The courtyard smelled of scorched stone and chemicals, the kind of bitter tang that clings to the back of the throat long after the shelling ends. Hot bricks radiated upward like open oven doors. Dust floated in the air in soft, ghostly spirals, catching the late morning light as though the town itself was exhaling after hours of bombardment. Metal fragments pinged and settled around the edges of the square, tiny reminders that the war had not finished with this place, not yet. 31 German women stood huddled near the far wall, their Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms streaked with soot, their hands raised or trembling or clasped to their chests in silent dread. They had been dragged across collapsing villages, across rumors, across a lifetime of propaganda telling them that Americans would harm them the moment they surrendered. For most of them, the fear was older than the war itself. One woman in the group clutched a cloth bag so tightly her knuckles shone white. Another blinked through tears that refused to fall. A third muttered a prayer under her breath. And at the center of them stood Helga Brandt, 25 years old, medical assistant, her blonde hair matted with dust, her breathing shallow as if she feared even air might betray her. She felt the heat on her shoulder hours before she understood it wasn't normal. But she didn't know its source. She only knew the war had a way of taking pieces of you without warning, and she was certain the next thing it took would be her life. Across the courtyard, the Americans were organizing themselves with the quiet efficiency of men who had lived too long in chaos and learned to impose order wherever they could. A nearby jeep idled with a faint metallic rattle, its hood still warm from the ride in. A dented GI canteen rolled lazily across the ground each time the breeze shifted, bumping against chunks of brick before settling into a soft clink. An abandoned pair of American leather gloves lay draped over a broken wheelbarrow, creased, oil-stained, unmistakably ordinary. That ordinariness made the scene all the more surreal for the POWs. These items belonged to men they had been told were animals, barbarians who tortured for sport, who stole, who humiliated, who would crush any woman unlucky enough to fall into their hands. Nothing in this courtyard looked like that. Nothing fit the picture they carried in their heads, and that mismatch was its own kind of terror. From the corner, a small battery-powered radio crackled to life. A burst of static, then a few bars of an upbeat swing tune drifted into the air as if conjured from another universe. The melody, bright, warm, unbothered, hung over the broken courtyard like a hallucination. Some of the women flinched at the sound, others stared, confused. How could music exist in the same world as falling shells? Helga wrapped her arms tighter around herself. The warmth under her jacket had spread to her shoulder blade, pressing like a hidden fever. She thought it was a bruise, or maybe shrapnel lodged too deep to feel. Her mind refused to explore the possibility that something worse was happening, something she could not see. Sergeant Walker moved toward the group, his boots crunching over the mosaic of brick fragments. He lifted a hand in a gesture meant to reassure, but the women recoiled as one. Not because he had done anything, only because everything they had ever been told insisted he someday would. His eyes swept over them, landing on each face for a heartbeat, assessing injuries, exhaustion, fear. But when he reached Helga, something shifted. His gaze flicked to her left shoulder. The glow beneath her torn jacket pulsed again. Just once, a deep orange flicker like breath drawn in. Walker froze. His jaw clenched. He'd seen that color before in the Ardennes, crawling across the snow after a misfired phosphorus flare lodged in a soldier's coat. It looked harmless at first, just another ember in a battlefield of embers, but it could burn through flesh, bone, equipment, anything that touched it. The women noticed his sudden change in posture, Helga noticed too. Her pulse leapt. She took a step back. Walker raised both hands, palms open. "Ma'am." "Don't move." His voice was low but edged with urgency. Unfortunately, urgency was the one thing guaranteed to terrify them more. Helga's breath hitched. She shook her head violently. "Nein. Don't touch me," she stammered in broken English. He took one slow step forward. She took two back. Her boot heel struck loose gravel. She nearly slipped. She steadied herself, but the heat beneath her jacket flared sharply. She winced and reached instinctively for her shoulder. Walker's stomach dropped. "No!" His voice cracked across the courtyard like another shell landing. Several women screamed. Others ducked. One dropped to her knees and covered her head. Walker didn't have time to explain. Didn't have time to argue. Didn't have time for anything except the one action that might keep her alive. The flare fragment under her jacket gave a tiny hiss. A sound only a man who had survived winters of artillery could recognize. Walker lunged. Helga saw a flash of movement, felt a rush of panic crack her ribs from the inside. She tried to twist away, but her boots slipped on the debris, and then the world became hands and motion and ripping fabric. A tearing sound, loud, violent, impossible to mistake, filled the courtyard. In a single brutal motion, Walker seized her jacket at the seams and tore it clean off her body. Helga screamed. The women around her screamed. Even the radio stuttered as if startled. Walker spun, flinging the jacket across the courtyard. It hit the ground with a soft thud, and then ignited in a white-orange burst that seared the air. For a moment, no one breathed. The fragment writhed and crackled inside the burning cloth, sending sparks into the dust. Walker shielded his eyes. Helga stared at the fire, trembling, unable to understand what had just happened. She had been sure, utterly, desperately sure, that the American was attacking her. But the thing on the ground was the truth she could not deny. He had torn her jacket off not to harm her, but because if he hadn't, she would be lying dead at his feet, and she did not know that 90 seconds earlier the only thing between her and a violent, burning death was the very man she had been taught to fear most. The moment the flare ignited on the ground, spitting white fire and hissing like something alive, the entire courtyard froze as if the world itself had stopped spinning. The burning jacket lay only yards away, a shredded pile of fabric that could so easily have been Helga's shoulder, her skin, her life. For a heartbeat, Helga could only stare at the flames. Her knees buckled, though she did not fall. Her breath trembled, though she did not cry. Shock wrapped around her like a second skin, cold, suffocating, refusing to let her think. The image of Sergeant Walker ripping her jacket off still hung sharp and violent in her mind. Every instinct in her body screamed that she had been assaulted. Every warning she had ever heard whispered the same message. If Americans touch you, you disappear. But then she saw the truth burning on the ground, bright and undeniable. The man she feared had saved her life, and yet, fear is not undone that easily. As the last of the flare sputtered into silence, Walker stepped toward her again, hands still lifted in a careful, deliberate gesture. She flinched so sharply her hair whipped across her face. "Ma'am, it's all right," he said softly. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone, and the tone frightened her even more. It was calm. Too calm. It reminded her of the way German officers spoke before issuing punishments. Walker took another step. Helga took 3 back. Her boots scraped against the broken stones, nearly catching on a fragment of brick. The other women watched with wide eyes, some clutching each other as if the ground beneath them might open. A corporal jogged forward with a canteen of water, offering it to Helga with an earnest nod. She recoiled as if he were holding a snake. "9," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "9. No." The corporal lowered the canteen slowly, confusion knitting his brow. To him he was offering water. To her he was closing a trap. Fear, when raised on propaganda, grows roots so deep that truth has no room to enter. For years, the Reich had fed these women stories of American cruelty, painted murals in schools showing U.S. soldiers with claws instead of hands, broadcast radio warnings that captured women would be humiliated or killed, printed leaflets depicting American camps as pits of starvation. Helga had memorized every word. Do not let them touch you. If you surrender, you are no longer a woman. They will take you away, and you will never be seen again. Now, faced with men who spoke gently and moved carefully, the terror only twisted tighter, because reality did not match the nightmares she had prepared for. And when fear and truth collide, fear often wins. The Americans resumed organizing the courtyard. A few carried crates to a shaded corner. Another inspected a jeep tire. Someone laughed, just a short, weary laugh between soldiers who had survived another morning. But to Helga's ears, the sound was sharp, unfamiliar, almost mocking. Her shoulder still burned faintly from where the flare's heat had grazed her skin. She pressed her palm against it without thinking, then snatched her hand away when pain shot across her ribs like a warning. The spot felt hotter than before. She told herself it was nothing, just nerves. Just the sun. But deep down, something felt wrong. A few yards away, 3 American soldiers were loading boxes onto a wagon. One paused, flicking open a shiny silver lighter. The small metal snap, so ordinary, so American, pierced the air. Helga jerked so violently that the women beside her cried out. The soldier glanced over, startled. Then he smiled awkwardly and slipped the lighter into his pocket. To the Americans, it was a habit. To the German women, it sounded like a signal. Sharp, crisp, ominous. One of the POWs whispered hoarsely, "They're calling others. They will separate us." Another said, "They will punish her for resisting." A third muttered, "We shouldn't have surrendered." Fear rippled through the group like wind stirring tall grass. It did not matter that nothing threatening was happening. It did not matter that the men were simply going about their duties. Fear had lived inside these women far longer than the Americans had. Sergeant Walker crouched beside the smoldering jacket, inspecting what remained of the flare fragment. His jaw tightened. He knew exactly how close she had been to a slow, agonizing death. He stood and looked toward Helga, who stood pinned between 2 broken columns as if she were trying to become part of the stone. He approached cautiously, each step measured, aware now of how deeply she feared him. Her breath rattled in her chest. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. He stopped several feet away. "You're safe," he said tenderly. She shook her head, backing up until her shoulder hit cold stone. To her, kindness was the most confusing threat of all. The Reich had taught her that Americans would strike with violence, not gentleness. So when none of the expected brutality appeared, when no one yelled, no one shoved, no one pointed a weapon, her terror grew more tangled. Maybe they were waiting. Maybe they were testing them. Maybe the real cruelty would come later. Fear whispers lies more fluently than truth speaks comfort. The glow beneath her jacket had vanished, but the heat remained, now spreading down her arm in a slow crawl. She winced, lifting her elbow slightly to relieve the pressure. One of the other women noticed and asked, "Bist du verletzt? Are you hurt?" Helga tensed. She didn't want to admit anything, not in front of the Americans, not when she didn't know what they would do if they learned she was wounded. In her training as a medical auxiliary, she had seen what phosphorus did to human skin. But she refused to let her mind consider the possibility that she had been carrying it, pressed against her flesh, for hours. No, it was just heat, just the sun. But even as she told herself this, the sensation sharpened, almost like something was gnawing through the fabric of her sleeve. She swallowed hard, fighting the urge to look. Walker stepped closer, and she snapped her gaze up, instinctively raising both hands. Her voice cracked. "Don't. Please." He froze. The hurt flickered across his face for just a moment. not because she feared him, but because he could not find a way to convince her she didn't need to. Behind him, an American private muttered, "Man, they're more scared of us than of the shells." The comment wasn't cruel, it was bewildered, but for Helga, the words felt like confirmation of everything she dreaded. They were watching, they were judging, they were planning. Her pulse hammered so loudly she could hear it in her ears. To calm themselves, two soldiers near the jeep began softly humming along with the radio's swing tune, an upbeat melody floating incongruously through the ruins of a bombed-out courtyard. For a moment, Helga stared at the radio, startled. Music. Real music. How could music exist in the same place she expected death? The Americans acted as if today was just another day, another duty, another part of the war. But for the women on the far side of the courtyard, every breath felt like the edge of a cliff. The burning sensation on Helga's shoulder suddenly throbbed again, sharper this time, like a warning from beneath her skin. She inhaled sharply, clutching the edge of her sleeve. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. But she could not ask for help. She could not admit weakness. She could not let an American touch her again. Fear had carved that rule into her bones, and so she pressed herself harder against the stone wall, praying the day would end, praying no one else would come near her, praying her body would stop betraying her with this spreading, impossible heat. She did not yet know that the danger she feared least, the jacket already, lying in ashes, had left behind one more ember, one that was still on her skin, still burning, still waiting. For several long minutes after the flare died out, no one moved. The German women remained pressed against the far wall, too afraid to breathe too loudly, too afraid that even exhaling might provoke the men who had just torn one of them from danger with terrifying force. And yet, it was not terror on the Americans' faces. It was concern. That contradiction unsettled Helga more than the fire ever could. Then, without warning, one of the older POWs, a woman in her 50s with deep lines etched across her face, swayed on her feet. She inhaled sharply, blinked twice, and collapsed. Her knees buckled first, then the rest of her body folded like paper. A sharp cry rose among the women, but what the Americans did next was the last thing any of them expected. Two soldiers sprinted forward, not with rifles, not with shouting, not with force. They dropped to their knees beside the woman as if approaching a fallen relative. "Easy, ma'am. We got you," one murmured, sliding an arm gently beneath her back. The other loosened her collar, brushed dust off her cheek, and said something softly to calm her, even though she couldn't understand him. They lifted her with careful precision, the kind used for carrying someone fragile. Not a prisoner, not an enemy, a human being. Helga felt her breath catch. This was not in the stories. As the men carried the fainted woman toward a shaded corner, a medic appeared with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He knelt beside her, checking her pulse, then reached for a canteen. A real American GI canteen, bolted metal, dented along one side, warm from the sun. He unscrewed the cap and poured a trickle of water onto her lips. The German women stared as if witnessing witchcraft. Water given freely, food given without condition, hands that touched without striking. Nothing made sense. Nearby, Sergeant Walker opened a crate and began pulling out items one by one. First came a stack of thin wool blankets, olive drab and neatly folded. Next were rows of small tin cups that clattered together like wind chimes as he unpacked them. Then came the food. He handed one blanket to a private. "Get these to the women. Slow, gentle. No sudden moves." The private nodded, almost solemnly, and approached the POWs with the careful steps of a man approaching a nest of frightened birds. He set the blankets down at their feet, not forcing, not handing, not crowding, just placing them within reach. The gesture was so simple it felt impossible. Helga looked at the blanket near her boot. She didn't touch it. She didn't dare. From the field kitchen at the edge of the courtyard, A curl of steam drifted into the air. A metal pot simmered over a portable stove, filling the space with a warm, unfamiliar scent. Salt, pepper, something like home, if home had not been destroyed by war. Cook, with sleeves rolled up, was heating small tins near the flame. When he lifted one, Helga caught the label. Spam. The can was slightly bulged from the heat. When he pried it open, the smell of warm pork spread across the courtyard. He sliced it quickly, placing pieces onto a tray beside round, pale crackers stamped with U.S. markings. K-ration biscuits, one soldier said with a nostalgic grin. Hard as rocks, but they'll keep you going. The Americans laughed quietly among themselves, as if remembering long marches, cold nights, and home-packed kits carried across oceans. To the women, the sound was strange, gentle, human. Helga had not heard a man laugh like that in months. Walker approached the group again, carrying the tin cups. Inside each cup sloshed clean water, cold, clear, astonishing. He crouched several feet away from them and set the first cup down, then another, and another. He didn't push them closer. He didn't insist they take them. He simply offered. "Ma'am, you're safe now," he said softly. The words drifted over the courtyard like something fragile. Safe. No one had called Helga safe since the war began. She shook her head anyway. Safety was a lie, she told herself. Safety was bait. Safety was a trick designed to make prisoners lower their guard. But her throat ached. Her lips were cracked, and the water caught the sunlight like a shard of promise. Still, she refused. Fear has its own sort of thirst, and it drinks pride before water. Behind Walker, another soldier was handing out food. He held the tray of Spam slices and K-ration biscuits like an offering in a sanctuary. One POW accepted a biscuit with trembling fingers, then stared at it as if unsure whether it was poison. Another reached for a slice of Spam, but pulled her hand back quickly, glancing around to see if she would be punished for it. No one punished anyone. The cook simply said, "There's more where that came from." His tone was matter-of-fact, not triumphant, as though feeding prisoners was no more unusual than feeding comrades. Helga's stomach clenched, not from hunger but from confusion so deep it unsettled her bones. Everything she was seeing contradicted everything she believed. These men didn't hate them. These men didn't want to hurt them. These men were treating them better than their own commanders had treated them in the last months of the war. And yet, the warmth on her shoulder kept pulsing. She told herself it was just the sun, but the burn had grown sharper, like a coal pressed beneath the skin. She rubbed her arm lightly. Walker glanced at the motion. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. Helga stiffened and stepped back instantly. "No," she said in a breathless whisper. He didn't move closer. He didn't question her. He simply nodded and stepped aside, giving her space, respecting her space. That alone disarmed her more than any act of violence could have. The blankets remained untouched. The cups remained untouched. The food remained untouched. But the Americans did not take the refusal as insult. They only continued setting items down patiently, making quiet conversation among themselves about supply lines, home, spring weather back in the States. The POWs listened in silence, absorbing every word as if eavesdropping on a different species. Helga watched Walker speak with another sergeant, their conversation low, professional, calm. She watched a private adjust the straps on a medical kit, treating it with the kind of care German officers rarely showed their own soldiers. She watched the cook wipe sweat from his brow with a stained handkerchief, humming an American tune under his breath. If this was the enemy, then what had she been fighting? She pressed her palm to the warm patch on her shoulder again. The pain flickered, sharp this time. She inhaled sharply, biting down on her lip. No one noticed, or so she hoped. For a moment, just a moment, Helga wondered whether she had misunderstood every warning she'd ever been given. whether the world she feared was not the world that existed. But fear is a prison that takes time to unlock. And even as kindness spread across the courtyard like slow sunlight, she could not forget the dark lessons drilled into her since girlhood. Americans hurt you. Americans trick you. Americans take you away. So when Walker approached again, holding a blanket under one arm and a tin cup in the other, Helga tensed, stepping back until her spine pressed against the cold stone wall. He stopped immediately, leaving more than enough space between them. "I won't harm you," he said quietly. She stared at him, searching for cruelty in his expression, but she found only fatigue, concern, and something even more disorienting: decency. She didn't know how to process decency, and in the silence of her confusion, the heat beneath her skin flared again, deeper now, quieter but unmistakable. Something was burning, not on the ground this time, on her. The warning came not from a shout, not from a command, but from a sound so small it nearly vanished beneath the noise of the courtyard. A tack, sharp, metallic, faint. Helga heard it. She didn't understand it. Walker heard it. And he understood it perfectly. He had hoped, prayed even, that the flare fragment had burned itself out when he ripped the jacket free. But the truth was already glowing beneath the thin fabric of Helga's sleeve, pulsing like a buried ember hungry for air. That soft, deadly crackle cut through the courtyard like a whispered prophecy. Walker's head snapped toward Helga. She was clutching her upper arm, pressing her palm against the heat she could no longer ignore. Her face was pale, her breath uneven. And beneath the gray cloth of her undershirt, a faint orange glow flickered again, brighter this time. The flare hadn't died. It had burrowed deeper. "Jesus," Walker whispered, stepping forward. Helga froze. Another touch, this one louder. Walker's blood ran cold. He had seconds. "Ma'am, don't move," he said, voice tight. It didn't matter that his tone was gentle. It didn't matter that he'd saved her once already. All Helga heard was the echo of every warning she had ever been given, every word from instructors, every whisper in the bunkers, every rumor from the Eastern Front. If Americans touch you, you disappear. She backed away from him so fast that her heel struck a brick shard. She stumbled but didn't fall, holding herself upright with one hand against the wall and one pressed tightly against her burning arm. Don't touch me," she cried out, her voice breaking. Walker raised both palms, trying to steady his breath, trying to make her understand with gestures alone. But understanding required trust. And trust was something war had burned out of her long ago. Behind her, the other POWs sensed the tension. They clustered together, whispering frantically, eyes darting between the American sergeant and the trembling woman pressed against the stone. What is he doing? Why is he going toward her again? He's angry. He must be angry. Fear stacked itself inside their voices like bricks in a collapsing wall. Helga squeezed her arm harder. The heat pulsed upward, biting deeper, hotter, spreading like something alive crawling beneath her skin. She gasped. Walker saw her flinch, saw her fingers jerk away from the pain, saw the glow brightening beneath her sleeve. "Ma'am, listen to me," he said. "You're not safe. Something's—" Another crackle erupted, bright enough now that even the POWs could see it through the thin cloth. Several women screamed. Walker's training and instincts collided hard with the reality before him. He had been cautious, gentle, patient. Those seconds had run out. He lunged. Helga shrieked, a raw, terrified sound that sliced the air open. She tried to twist away, tried to back into the wall, tried to escape the touch she believed would destroy her. But Walker wasn't reaching for her. He was reaching for the flare eating through her clothes. His hand caught the fabric at her shoulder. She screamed louder, the noise breaking into a sob. In her mind, the war had finally found her. The thing she feared had arrived. Walker braced one foot against the ground, gripped the cloth at the seam, and tore. The ripping noise exploded through the courtyard, loud and brutal, echoing off the broken walls. Fabric split down her side in a single, violent motion. Threads snapped. Buttons flew. Dust swirled where the cloth had been. Helga staggered forward, the force knocking her off balance. Her knees buckled. She fell to the ground, curling inward, arms wrapped around her chest, convinced she was being attacked, humiliated, punished. The other POWs cried out in horror. Some covered their eyes. Some rushed toward her before stopping short, terrified of the Americans. Some simply froze, trembling. Walker didn't stop to explain. He ripped the last piece of cloth from her arm, exposing the glowing fragment lodged near the sleeve seam. "Get back!" he yelled. He flung the burning fabric across the courtyard with every ounce of strength in his arm. It hit the dirt. 2 seconds passed. Then it detonated. A burst of white-orange fire shot upward, smaller than the first, but still fierce, still deadly. The heat rippled across the courtyard. Smoke curled sharply into the air, and then silence. Absolute, breathless silence. Helga remained on the ground, arms wrapped around herself, her breath shaking as if her lungs had forgotten how to work. She felt no attack, no blow, no cruelty. Only the cold shock of air against her exposed skin and the faint sting of where the heat had kissed her arm. Slowly, so slowly, she raised her head. Walker stood a few feet away, chest heaving, hands still poised as if expecting another explosion. His face was not hard, not triumphant, not cruel. It was stricken. He looked at her the way men look at someone they nearly lost. Worry sat heavy in his eyes. Relief softened his shoulders. And something else, something Helga had not expected to find in the eyes of an enemy soldier. Humanity. She blinked. The world felt tilted, disjointed, refusing to fit the shape it had held before. The stories she carried inside her, stories drilled into her bones, began to fracture. Americans will hurt you. Americans will shame you. Americans will take everything you have. Yet here stood a man who had risked his life, his safety, and perhaps even his reputation to save her without hesitation. She pressed her palm gently to her shoulder. The skin was warm, but intact, barely reddened. Not melted, not burned through. She swallowed hard. Walker took a step toward her, slow, cautious, careful enough to make the air tremble. "You're all right," he said softly. "It's gone. You're safe." The words washed over her like warm water. But fear does not vanish. It cracks, and in the cracks, something new takes root. Not trust, not yet, but the first tiny question. If the enemy risked everything to save her. Had she ever known the truth at all? Around the courtyard, the POWs stared in stunned silence. A few wiped their eyes. One whispered a prayer. Another murmured, "He saved her. He truly saved her." The American soldiers stood just as still, young men far from home, watching the aftermath of a miracle they hadn't fully expected. None smiled, none bragged. They simply breathed out, grateful the worst had passed. Walker knelt beside Helga, leaving ample space so she wouldn't panic. He didn't touch her. He didn't reach out. He only lowered his voice. "No one here wants to hurt you." She looked into his eyes. For the first time, she didn't look away. Courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it comes from running toward fire. Sometimes it comes from surviving it. But sometimes the rarest form of courage is the willingness to question everything you once believed. And there, in that ruined courtyard outside Magdeburg, surrounded by dust and silence and the lingering scent of burned cloth, Helga felt something break. Not her body, not her spirit, but the walls fear had built inside her. The man she'd been taught to fear had saved her twice, and nothing inside her mind fit the world she saw anymore. Hoi Fi, Aftermath and Truth Revealed, 1001.202. Kachuyen tuan tui, kong mota hu ung, kong fantik, kong meta. For a long moment after the flare exploded, Helga stayed on her knees, arms wrapped around herself, breath trembling as if every inhale might shatter her. The courtyard felt impossibly still, too still, like the world was holding its breath beside her. Then she felt a shadow fall over her. Not harsh, not looming, just present. "Ma'am, can you stand?" It was Walker's voice, steady, low, almost gentle. She blinked up at him, instinctively recoiling even though he made no move toward her. He wasn't reaching out. He wasn't trying to lift her. He was simply waiting. And something in that waiting, patient, unhurried, unsettled her more than any command could have. She nodded weakly. He stepped back to give her space. Two medics approached, their hands open in the same cautious way Walker had used. Helga hesitated, then let them guide her toward a canvas tent at the edge of the courtyard. The ground wavered beneath her feet. The adrenaline that had carried her through the past minutes drained all at once, leaving her legs weak and unsteady. Inside the tent, the air was dim and smelled of antiseptic and canvas warmed by the afternoon sun. A single lantern flickered on a supply crate, casting soft shadows over stacked bandages and metal trays. A woman in an American Red Cross armband stepped forward, the first female face Helga had seen since capture. "Sit, sweetheart," the nurse said gently, guiding Helga onto a cot. "Let me take a look at that arm." Helga stiffened at the touch, but the nurse's hands were warm and steady. She rolled up the torn sleeve and whistled softly. "You're lucky," she murmured. Helga didn't understand, so the nurse called out to a nearby staffer, "Get the interpreter." A young man appeared moments later, German by accent but American by uniform. He crouched beside the cot. "She wants to explain what happened," he translated. Helga swallowed, her throat tight. The nurse pointed to the reddened patch along Helga's upper arm, the slight blistering where the heat had grazed her skin. "If that flare had stayed on you," the nurse said, her voice calm but firm, "it would have burned through the bone." The interpreter delivered the words in German, slow and clear. Helga's breath stopped, burned through the bone. She looked down at her arm, at the intact skin, at the faint heat still radiating from the wound, and a wave of realization crashed through her so forcefully she pressed her palm to her forehead. The person she feared most. The man she had screamed at. The enemy she'd been taught to hate was the reason she was still alive. Something broke inside her then. Not physically, not visibly, but deeply, quietly. The kind of break that happens when a belief you carried your whole life suddenly collapses under the weight of truth. The nurse worked methodically, cleaning the burn with practiced care. She dabbed ointment onto a sterile pad, murmuring reassurance Helga couldn't understand but felt nonetheless. "You're going to be all right," the interpreter translated. Helga nodded, unable to find her voice. When the nurse finished, the interpreter stepped aside and Helga looked around the tent. Really looked. For the first time since capture, she saw the Americans not as shapes or uniforms or threats, but as people. One soldier stood beside a metal stove, pouring coffee from a dented GI pot into small enamel mugs. The smell drifted across the tent, rich, bitter, unmistakably American. He handed one mug to another soldier, then poured a half cup for himself. They clinked the mugs together in a tired, wordless toast. Another soldier sat at a folding table, pencil tucked behind his ear, a bright yellow No. 2 pencil, the kind she had once seen in a Sears catalog before the war. He flipped open a notebook and began writing down arrival numbers, assigning dates, checking his watch as if accuracy still mattered in a collapsing world. A medic in rolled sleeves checked the bandages of another POW, a woman who had cut her leg during the shelling. He smiled at her gently, tapping her ankle to signal he wasn't going to hurt her before applying the dressing. The movements were so casual, so routine, so deeply human that they struck Helga harder than the flare ever could. This was not the enemy she had been taught to fear. These men weren't monsters. They weren't executioners. They weren't waiting for permission to harm her. They were doing their jobs. and doing them with a dignity she had not seen in months. She watched Walker step into the tent, dirt still on his uniform, sweat darkening the fabric at his shoulders. He spoke briefly with the nurse, asking about Helga with a concerned furrow in his brow. Then he stepped back, letting the medics handle their work, as if he did not want to frighten her again. That thought, frighten her, made her chest tighten. The man who had risked his life to save hers was now afraid of being too close. The interpreter returned to her side. "He wants to know how you're feeling," he said. Helga looked over at Walker, who was pretending to adjust his gear so he wouldn't stare. She lowered her gaze, fingers twisting in her lap. "Tell him." She paused, searching for the right words. "Tell him I didn't know. I didn't understand." The interpreter translated. Walker nodded slowly, his eyes softening. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But the tension in his shoulders eased. Helga sat quietly for several minutes, listening to the calm rhythm of the tent, the clink of metal cups, the scratch of pencil on paper, the low hum of American voices carrying news of home, weather, baseball scores, mail delivery schedules, ordinary things, beautiful things, things that had nothing to do with cruelty. Her gaze drifted toward the entrance flap. Outside, soldiers were directing POWs toward a safer area, handing out additional blankets, pointing to water barrels, checking injuries with an almost parental concern. A strange warmth filled her chest, not the burning heat of the flare, but something gentler, something she barely recognized. Gratitude, not only for survival, but for gentleness, for decency. For the first glimpse of a world she had been told did not exist. A world where enemies did not behave like enemies. A world where mercy looked ordinary. A world where the people she feared most had risked everything to protect her. When the nurse finished wrapping her arm, she patted Helga's hand lightly. "You're safe now," she said. The interpreter translated softly. Safe. The word no longer felt like a lie. It felt like a beginning. The nurse's words lingered long after she stepped away, long after the bandage cooled against Helga's skin, long after the interpreter retreated to help another patient. "You're safe now." For the first time since the war began, Helga did not instinctively reject the idea. She didn't fully believe it, not yet, but the thought no longer felt impossible. It felt like a door cracked open in a dark room. She sat on the cot silently, fingers brushing the edge of the gauze. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted low across the courtyard, warming the canvas walls of the tent and casting stripes of gold across the floor. Through those stripes, she could hear the Americans moving, boots on dirt, clipped voices, the scrape of crates being shifted. None of those sounds carried aggression. None carried menace. They carried normalcy, order, discipline, life continuing. And it struck her that she had not felt part of life for months. When she finally stepped out of the tent, the courtyard looked different. Not because anything had changed, but because she had. The same soldiers who had terrified her earlier were now passing around a battered metal pot of GI coffee. They held their cups in both hands, lifting them toward their faces as though savoring the warmth more than the taste. A couple of them joked about how weak the brew was. Another complained that he missed his mother's kitchen. A young private listened with a wistful smile, too young to have a kitchen of his own to miss. On a crate nearby, the soldier, with the number 2 pencil, continued scribbling in his notebook, now pausing to tap the eraser thoughtfully against his chin. When one POW approached timidly to give her number, he nodded politely, repeated the number back to ensure accuracy, and wrote it with neat, careful strokes. Helga stood on the tent's threshold, watching as if witnessing a world she was never meant to see. A world without terror. A world where men did their jobs with dignity and without cruelty. A world where wounded strangers received tenderness, not suspicion. A world that did not match the one she'd been taught her entire life. She spotted him then, Sergeant Walker. He stood with his hands on his hips, listening to another soldier report on supply counts. Dust clung to his sleeves. Sweat had drawn pale tracks down his face. He looked exhausted, human. And yet the tension in his posture betrayed worry. Worry for her. Helga's stomach fluttered strangely. The man she had feared most now seemed like the one person in the camp who had seen her at her most vulnerable and still treated her with care. She stepped toward him before she fully realized she was doing it. Walker noticed her movement and straightened quickly. He did not smile. He did not reach for her. He kept respectful distance, falling silent so she would not feel crowded. He even glanced at the ground, as though uncertain whether meeting her eyes would frighten her again. The humility of that gesture, so small, so earnest, shook something loose inside her. She cleared her throat. Her voice felt fragile, as if unused for years. "Sergeant." He looked up. Helga swallowed. This is the moment, she told herself, a moment that could bridge the gulf between everything she'd been taught and everything she had now lived. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving me." The interpreter wasn't needed. Walker understood. His eyes widened slightly, not in pride, not in triumph, but in a kind of startled relief. He nodded once, the gesture simple and sincere. "You're welcome, ma'am," he said gently. Anyone would have done the same. But that wasn't true, and both of them knew it. Not everyone leaps toward danger for a stranger. Not everyone chooses mercy in the heat of war. Not everyone sees humanity where they were taught to see enemies. Helga felt her throat tighten. Other POW women gathered nearby, whispering as they watched her speak to him. One of them, a girl barely 20, murmured, "He didn't hurt you?" Helga shook her head. Another woman, older and pale, whispered, They're not like we were told." A third stepped closer, clutching a blanket to her chest. "I saw him," she said quietly. "He saved you twice." The realization spread through them like warmth seeping into frozen ground. Some POWs wiped their eyes openly. Others stared in dazed silence at the Americans now tending the wounded, refilling water barrels, or speaking softly to each other under the waning sunlight. For the first time, the women weren't looking at a threat. They were looking at an unexpected truth. Later, as Helga sat on an overturned crate, sipping from a tin cup of water, the interpreter passed by and paused beside her. "You know," he said conversationally, "I asked one of them why they help prisoners the way they do." Helga looked up. He shrugged lightly. "The soldier told me, in America, we try to help folks who need help. Just like that, as if it was obvious." The words landed with a weight she couldn't describe. In America, we try to help folks who need help. Not propaganda, not ideology, not pride, just a simple philosophy, one that felt more powerful than any weapon she'd seen in the war. She stared into her cup, watching the surface tremble slightly with her breath. Help folks who need help. Had anyone in Germany said that? Had she ever heard those words before today? She thought of home, if home could still be called that. Bombed streets, rubble where schools once stood, lines for stale bread, children with hollow cheeks, mothers who cried at night when they thought no one was listening, instructors shouting warnings about American devils, neighbors whispering about traitors, fear twisting everything, food, safety, trust, into something brittle and bitter. She thought of her father's hands, cracked from labor and cold, her mother rationing potatoes until they tasted like dust, her brother whispering that the Americans would come with fire and chains, and she thought of Sergeant Walker, ripping her jacket not to harm her, but to save her. She paused, reading the lines again, tracing the curve of the letters with her thumb. She did not know whether she would keep the paper or tear it later, but the truth it held felt undeniable. A truth she had seen with her own eyes, felt in her own skin, a truth she would carry long after the war ended. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the sky turned golden, then amber, then the deep orange of smoldering coals. The light washed over everything, the torn bricks, the battered jeep, the tents fluttering softly in the wind, and softened their edges. Even the scars on the courtyard seemed less harsh under that fading glow. Sergeant Walker approached with 2 mugs of hot coffee. He handed one to her, careful to keep a respectful distance. "It's the good stuff," he said lightly. "Well, the best we've got." Helga accepted it. The tin was warm against her palms, and the steam curled upward, bringing with it a scent she had begun to associate with these men. Bitterness and comfort in the same breath. She nodded. "Thank you, Sergeant." He dipped his head and stepped back, giving her space once more. A habit now, a courtesy he never failed. Helga sipped the coffee slowly. It was strong, almost too strong, but she savored it. For years, she had lived on rations so thin they barely tasted like food. This, simple, hot, honest, felt like a luxury. But more than that, it felt like dignity. As the last sliver of sunlight faded, the narrator of the day, time itself, seemed to settle into a quieter tone. And Helga's thoughts turned toward something larger than the courtyard, larger than her fear, even larger than war. She thought of the men around her, men who treated wounds with gentle hands, men who shared blankets with shivering prisoners, men who carried fainting women as if carrying their own kin, men who leapt toward burning phosphorus without hesitation. And she realized something that once would have been unthinkable. These men were her enemy only because someone had told her they were. They had not arrived with cruelty. They had not acted with hatred. They had not used victory as permission to degrade or destroy. They had chosen discipline. They had chosen restraint. They had chosen mercy. And mercy, she now understood, was a form of power stronger than any weapon. Later that night, when the soldiers prepared to rotate watch, someone near the fire said, "Boys, this is what the greatest generation ought to be proud of. Not the medals, not the battles. This, taking care of folks." The words drifted into the darkness, soft but unmistakably true. Another soldier responded, "This is the America I want to go home to. The one my dad always talked about." Helga didn't need the interpreter to understand the sentiment. She saw it in their faces. The pride, the decency, the sense of duty that had shaped every action she'd witnessed that day. For the first time, she wondered what the world might look like if nations were judged not by their victories, but by the kindness they showed when no one was watching. Long after the fire dimmed, long after the cigarettes burned to stubs, long after the courtyard fell quiet except for distant night birds, Helga wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and looked up at the emerging stars. Back home, Germany lay in ruins. Cities she once walked through were nothing but ash. Voices she loved had been swallowed by war. Fear and lies had shaped her world so completely that but to save her, stepping back so she wouldn't feel threatened, checking on her from afar with genuine concern. She blinked hard as emotion rose in her chest. As the sun dipped lower, casting the courtyard in amber light, Helga found Walker again. He wasn't looking at her. He was tightening straps on a supply pack, talking softly with the corporal about the next prisoner transport. She approached slowly, stopping at a polite distance. He turned, surprised. "I'm not afraid now," she said quietly. The sentence wasn't perfect. Her accent thickened, but the meaning held. Walker's expression softened. Not triumphant, not smug, just quietly relieved. "I'm glad to hear that, ma'am," he replied. She hesitated, then added, "Back home. They told us lies." He didn't press for details. He only nodded, letting her speak at her own pace. "You saved me," she continued. "Twice. I won't forget." A faint smile touched his lips. "War's hard enough without letting folks get hurt when they don't have to." The interpreter, passing by again, translated. Helga let the words sink deep. "War's hard enough. So help when you can. So protect those who are afraid. So do good even when the world is falling apart." That simple American philosophy, born not from ideology but from character, felt like a lantern, placed in a long, dark corridor. She looked at him, at the other soldiers, at the Americans tending the wounded and sharing coffee and writing reports with pencil tips worn to stubs. And for the first time, she felt something she had not expected to feel in the hands of the enemy. Gratitude. Deep, steady, unshakable gratitude. "Thank you," she said again, softer this time, almost a whisper, not to Walker alone, but to every man in the courtyard, to the country that raised them, to the values that shaped them, to the decency that saved her life. And somewhere inside her, quiet as a heartbeat, something shifted forever. Evening settled slowly over the temporary holding camp, the kind of slow descent that made the air feel softer, quieter, almost forgiving. The courtyard that had once echoed with panic and misunderstanding now hummed with a gentler rhythm, boots scuffing dirt, low voices trading end-of-day reports, the faint clink of mess tins being stacked. Helga sat on a wooden crate near the tent, her American-issued blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The wool was coarse but warm, carrying the faint scent of smoke and pine, and something else. Safety, perhaps. A feeling she had almost forgotten. A few yards away, several American soldiers lounged beside a crate of rations, passing a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes between them. They lit the ends with a shared Zippo, its tiny flame flickering gold in the dimming light. They inhaled deeply, leaning back as though letting the day slide from their shoulders. One soldier offered a cigarette to another who looked too young to be at war at all. The youngster accepted, cupping the flame carefully, smiling a little as he exhaled. For a moment, despite the dirt on their boots and the exhaustion in their faces, they looked like boys at a late summer bonfire rather than men who had fought through Europe. Helga watched them quietly. She no longer looked with fear or suspicion or dread. She looked with something far heavier, far deeper, understanding. Earlier that evening, when a medic gave her a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper to record her injury, she had found herself writing long after the required notes were done. She hadn't meant to write a reflection. She hadn't meant to write something personal. But the words had come anyway, steady and certain. Courage is not hurting your enemy. Courage is saving someone who feared completely that she had not known how to breathe without them, until today. Today, for the first time, she saw another path, a world where enemies showed compassion, where strangers saved lives, where mercy spoke louder than propaganda, a world she hadn't believed could exist, until it held her in its arms. The final thoughts that settled inside her felt like a prayer, though she didn't speak them aloud. Greatest generation. They are not great because they won. They are great because they kept their humanity when the world asked them not to. This is the America they told us to fear. And yet, this is the America I will remember with gratitude. In a time when the world was breaking, they chose kindness. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the blanket warm her bruised skin. Perhaps, she thought, America had not only saved her life, perhaps it had shown her a truth she could carry into whatever future remained. A truth for her, a truth for the soldiers, and a truth for anyone listening today. Solija jen luk chung tan ho lai min tung la e. Perhaps it is time to remember who we once